Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the State Library of South Australia. My name is Rick Saar, and I am the President of the Friends of the State Library, meeting here in the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, whose spiritual connection with this land is still just as strong today as it has been for tens of thousands of years. And it's important to note that the sort of thing we're doing here with this series of lectures is exactly what Kaurna people would have been doing here on the banks of the Karawera Parry for all these tens of thousands of years, having discussions, raising issues and sharing knowledge, which is what this series is all about. This is what's called the proximity round, where we gather people from typically this precinct, North Terrace, etc., to come and talk about their area of specialty and to bring knowledge and raise discussions. It's called the proximity round because it relates to people who are proximate to us. We had 8 of them last year, we've got 8 of them this year. I was going to give it the name of the gather round, but Mally rang me and said, sorry mate, that's been taken. So we're calling it the proximity round, so we have people from a whole range of North Terrace precincts to come and speak with us. And tonight we have someone very, very special, Greg Mackie, OAM. And I'm delighted that Greg is here tonight. I could spend the next 15 minutes saying something about his antecedents and background and work history, but I don't want to take up 15 minutes of your time because you wouldn't hear as much from him. But let me give you a quick little 2-minute snapshot of the peripatetic way that this particular individual has adorned Adelaide and raised the profile of this fair city in monumental ways. I first met Greg when he was the proprietor of the Imprints bookstore, but that goes back a long time. That might be a lot of your first experience of him as well. But in between time, here's a quick little dot point. Funded the West End Association, Executive Director of Arts SA. There's no chronological order here, it's all over the place. Flinders University Distinguished Alumni Award, the Rand Government's Deputy Chief Executive of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Adelaide City Councillor twice, the brains behind Thinkers in Residence. He's been head of the Office for Ageing, the CEO of the History Trust, a former board member of Feast, former board member of the Dunstan Foundation, the Dame Roma Trust, a trustee of the Adelaide Festival Centre, the Council of UniSA, Writers' Week Committee, Libraries Board, and the Adelaide Film Festival awardee of the Betty and James, or the Bettison and James Award. The only thing he hasn't done is played football for the Crows. But you never know, that might be something he does after his semi-retirement that he's going to share sometime during the course of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure it is to have such a son of South Australia. Please welcome Greg Mackie.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. I'm exhausted just casting back, and all I can say is the list is long and so are the years. So, good evening all. Rick, I echo your acknowledgement that this land always was and always will be Kaurna country. And I'm delighted to acknowledge the valued and esteemed colleagues, peers and friends from the cultural heritage sector, former customers of Imprints, there's many here, and also Elaine Benstead, soon to be departing and soon to be gracing this very venue with her own proximity round contribution. Beverly Voigt, Manager of Heritage SA, and of course many beloved History Trust colleagues, former History Trust colleagues, future History Trust colleagues and history guardians. As most of you would have previously heard me bang on at some point over the last 9 years at the helm of the History Trust of South Australia, I am not, nor have I ever pretended to be, an historian. I respectfully defer to the professionals and enthusiasts, the curators and storytellers with whom I've had the privilege to serve in my role over the last 9 years. And this being so, if I've erred this evening in any recollection of a date or sequence of events, I humbly beg your indulgence and invite your correction during the discussion part of the evening. In this evening's allocated time, and it is only around 30 minutes, it's my intention to offer a set of non-chronological reflections on this place, the North Terrace Cultural Precinct, as it is commonly referred to these days, and as in times past, it has also been known as the North Terrace Cultural Campus. I'd like to dedicate this talk this evening to the memory of the late Hannah Schultz, who died a couple of years ago, a colleague of ours at the History Trust, while serving as my executive officer and major projects manager with the History Trust. And before that, Hannah was Arts SA's Director of Cultural Heritage and Major Projects, and way back before that was the manager of HR in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I knew back then that Hannah was something special, and I convinced her to step away from HR and join the team at Arts SA. And I think everyone at Arts SA, and certainly those of us at the History Trust who had the joy of working with and learning from Hannah, it was very, very special. Back in 2006-07, Hannah project managed for me in my capacity as Art Supremo, the first ever major review of the state's collections storage facilities. The price tag back then scared, and since scared, every government of the day, until the Marshall government saw the opportunity of under cover of COVID, budget process. While under my leadership at Arts SA, Hannah also undertook a major review of all the arts statutory authority legislation around that same time, and this brought all arts and cultural acts under ministerial delegation of the then Premier Mike Rann and his Minister assisting, John Hill, into alignment on matters of government policy such as gender balance and board size. Hannah died unexpectedly a couple of years back and is still greatly missed by me and my senior colleagues, so much so that in fact the boardroom of our new headquarters, or newish headquarters on North Terrace, has been named the Hannah Schultz meeting room in her memory. In my past journeys over the decades as what I consider to be, if people say to me, how do we describe, what you've done? And I always revert to, I'm a practitioner of cultural development. I've been a bookseller, as Rick referred. I've hosted literary public events and programmed and presented Adelaide Writers' Week, member of the library's board, yada, 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 and then up the slippery pole in Premier and Cabinet, and over to health and ageing. In the latter two roles in Premier and Cabinet, I was the line manager to the directors of the State Library, the South Australian Museum, the Art Gallery of South Australia, Carrick Hill and Art Lab Australia, as well as a small phalanx of executives in Arts SA itself. Incidentally, I was never formally the line manager of the CEO of the History Trust of South Australia. As my predecessor in this role at the History Trust, Margaret Anderson, was wont to remind me, and quite frequently, I was never her boss. She had me hoodwinked on this for 9 years, that as she worked for a trust, she was different. I indulged her recalcitrance, but note that every time Marg had a problem, it was to me that she turned for a fix. Over those years, and this assistance extended to sourcing funds for the History Trust in the mid-2000s, redevelopment of the Migration Museum's permanent galleries, the rescue of the steam tug Nelsabee from sinking, and the securing of dedicated annual funding for the History Festival. I'd like to think that I've been a friend to the History Trust and to history for a very long time. I always had, therefore, a soft spot for the History Trust in those DPC roles because, in a sense, the History Trust was the runt of the litter. It was the youngest, it was the smallest in terms of body count, but geographically it was actually only beaten by the State Library of South Australia when it comes to footprint through the public libraries network. Given the ambit of my talk today, i.e. the precinct or the proximity of the North Terrace Cultural Precinct, I'm choosing to recklessly ignore the chronometer and start in the late 70s, and then I will just hippity-hop up and down through the decades. Such was the malaise along North Terrace by the late 70s that the Tonkin Liberal government's Minister for the Arts, the first ever dedicated Minister for the Arts following Don Dunstan's nurturing from his own Premier's office, the much respected by both sides of Parliament and in both chambers, the Honourable Murray Hill MLC, held the fledgling portfolio. Murray Hill's arts advisor was, for those with long memories, none other than the now Honourable Dr. Diana Laidlaw AM, who herself was later to serve 2 terms as a much respected former Minister for the Arts in the Brown-Olsen era. Back in 1979, the then Minister, Hill, as in Murray Hill, commissioned Dr. Robert Edwards to undertake a major review of the North Terrace Cultural Campus, and it was entitled Museum Policy and Development in South Australia. Because we're a history organisation, we actually had not 1 but 2 copies, and it had been completely lost in the annals and records of the South Australian public sector and the South Australian government, to the point that we decided to sacrifice 1 copy in order to scan it in its entirety as a PDF, and people can now access that through the History Trust website. At the time of the Edwards Review, the South Australian Museum, which effectively this review is fundamentally focused on how do we solve a problem like the South Australian Museum. And I preface this, or put the caveat, I love the South Australian Museum. For most of us, it holds very, very warm and special cultural memories. But as an institution, it has not kept up with the times. And there are many factors in my sense of it that have contributed to that. At the time of the Edwards Review, the South Australian Museum was deficit-ridden, failing to achieve its statutory purpose, that being to exhibit and collect in areas of natural science, research, ethnography and social history. The final report that I just showed was delivered in June 1991, but its findings had commenced implementation in 1981, but the findings had begun implementation in late 1980 with the introduction of the History Trust of South Australia Bill, which was enacted with unanimous bipartisan support in 1981. Included among its outcomes, that review amalgamated for the first time the objects conservation units of each of the big 3 collecting institutions to establish Art Lab Australia, a wholly government-owned enterprise under the Minister for the Arts. The review had recognised that the major malaise that had befallen the SA Museum, low morale, debt, mission failure, sound familiar? It was decided that the museum ought to be relieved of the hitherto unfulfilled social history ambit. With the approaching 1986 sesquicentenary of the 1836 proclamation of government in the province of South Australia, the History Trust, that fact I can be confident is correct, the History Trust was charged with establishing the South Australian Maritime Museum at Port Adelaide and the Museum of Migration and Settlement, both as sesquicentenary projects. And back in 1976, the Dunstan government had acquired the beleaguered old Birdwood Mill Museum, and ministerial ownership was transferred to the History Trust In 1988, the old Burwood Mill Museum's name was changed to the National Motor Museum of Australia, which in that very classically Australian way has been abbreviated to the National Motor Museum, or NMM is our in-house code. Of course, former Premier John Bannon held the arts portfolio and continued what was largely back then a bipartisan project to grow the cultural infrastructure of the state. And special shout out to Angela, who enjoyed, who was our First Lady for much of the 1980s. A state history centre was recommended to be established under the direction of the History Trust, and it was envisaged that that history centre would be located in the Jervois building, which we now know as the Mortlock Chamber. That was resisted, and at the time so much of the focus was on the malaise of the South Australian Museum. Despite incredible collections and despite very passionate and committed professionals, something was not working. Fast forward to 2024-25, and what have we seen? A Premier's review into the South Australian Museum, a still current Legislative Council Statutory Authorities Review Committee hearing underway into both the South Australian Museum and the Art Gallery of South Australia. And while the media have latterly turned their eyes to golf, things are far from resolved. Regrettably, and don't get me wrong, go golf. I don't get it, but then hey, I don't get cricket. Sorry, Bernie. I don't really get much ball sport. Well, some ball sport I get. I do not propose in the allocated 30 minutes, which I've now managed to fritter away 10, 12 minutes, to venture further into the specifics of what, when and how our collecting institutions might dig themselves out of the malaise, the structural and budget malaise that all find themselves in. Regrettably, decades of budget cuts later, and despite a significant top-up of funding in 2014, which was only then removed in the pernicious name of efficiency dividends in the ensuing years, each of our state collecting institutions are, sadly, a diminishing version of that which they once were. We also await with interest the long-promised and much vaunted arts policy, perhaps to be released during a festival close to us in the near future. Who knows? I do remember, and I still will hold my head up on this, on my role statement as the new Arts Supremo, I was tasked first and foremost with developing a 10-year strategy for the arts. And the first meeting I had with Mike Rann, I went in and said to him, Premier, mate, I can deliver you a 10-year plan, but what I have to tell you is that politically you won't like what you hear, because at that stage, pretty well everything was broken, either technically insolvent, and as a statutory authority you can't actually become insolvent because cash flow and treasury guarantees ensure its survival. So I want to venture some careful reflections on the recent and current state of our cultural sector. I do this not in my capacity as CEO with the History Trust of South Australia, rather with the benefit of having once worked up in the helicopter, or the ivory tower as some would regard it. I have been privileged to serve from several vantage points. I make these observations very carefully and selectively as a long-time practitioner of cultural development, ever mindful of my contractual obligations as a public sector executive, but perhaps with the modicum of courage that comes with being only 132 more sleeps or sleepless nights away from my personal risorgimento, otherwise referred to as retirement. As was touched on in Rick's introduction, I've been a long time in service and endured the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and misfortune, whether as a shopkeeper, as the proprietor of imprints, as a cultural programmer. Service has been at the core of my ethos, and it needs to remain at the core of a public sector which becomes increasingly fixated on mobility. And I absolutely understand the importance of public sector mobility, but my cautionary note is what that means is, and it's particularly more common amongst younger workers, you stay in a job for 2 years, things get passed, the parcel gets kicked down the road, can gets kicked down the road, and nobody ends up taking ultimate responsibility for fixing things up. While the History Trust was established with the ambition to see brought to reality a dedicated general social history museum, timing, as I have come to learn time and time again, is everything in showbiz and politics. The Marshall Liberals promised in 2018 to work with the History Trust to develop a business case for an Adelaide Museum of South Australia's history, a MOSA, and some of you heard me bang on or read me banging on about this for a number of years. It was to that ambitious goal that I deployed Hannah Schultz as the project manager. As was promised, the outline business case was delivered to the Marshall government in January 2022, and it remains accessible fully on our History Trust website for anyone interested in interrogating the underpinnings of that business case. A change of government occurred in March 2022, and that put pay to that vision. Disappointingly, obviously, subjectively, they failed to either advance the proposal to a full business case or indeed to formally kill it off, I suspect rather hoping that we would just lose interest and schlep away. One of the realities of being a government-appointed board, being beholden to a government-appointed board, is we too are beholden to the government not to make waves. I honestly think that this is how our friends at the SA Museum got into the mess they now find themselves. When I cast my mind back to 2004 and my first year as Executive Director of Arts SA, we had a technically, and I alluded to this earlier, insolvent ASO, a biennial Adelaide Fringe that was reeling from a $375,000 operating loss, a technically insolvent Adelaide Festival Centre Trust, an Adelaide Festival of Arts that was debt-laden in the aftermath of the Peter Sellers 2002 festival imbroglio, and a state theatre company that was on its knees. Australian Dance Theatre was on its knees. Despite many, many good things that had occurred in the 90s, you can't love all your children equally. And politically, as whoever the minister of the day is, difficult choices need to be made. The system, the cultural system, has developed what's called arm's length peer assessment, and we're seeing this played out in the national arena at the moment, where a decision is taken and that then at the end of the day someone objected to and the decision has been reversed. Arm's length peer assessment is the best system only because it is the least worst system. And the alternative is to let the Trumps of the world take unilateral decisions such as we're now reading on a daily basis. Art Lab Australia by 2002 was also in deep doo-doo. As is the nature of things, the State Library redevelopment project faced all kinds of unthinkable value management compromises, and I have first-hand memory as a member of the Libraries Board from around 2000 to 2003. The newly minted Premier and Minister for the Arts, the Honourable Mike Rann, endured the ignominy of a public dressing down at the official launch of the State Library redevelopment by none other than Rupert Murdoch. That insult so wounded Mike that relations with the Libraries Board reached a nadir. And he offloaded ministerial delegation for the State Library and its public libraries network to the Minister assisting the Premier in the Arts, the Honourable John Hill. Great man, wonderful minister. I served him with great pride, and he nurtured the arts portfolio in a far more applied way than a man who's also Premier and Minister for 5 other portfolios, trying to re-establish the state's AAA credit rating could. So, I invite you now to cast your minds back to the early noughties. Ron Radford reigned supreme at the Art Gallery, and Professor Tim Flannery was director at the SA Museum. No question that Tim was other than a brilliant and effective science communicator. I love him. But he had absolutely no idea how to run a complex business and cultural institution like a museum. So, and this is before my time, Arts SA created a new position that had never before existed, that of general manager, to actually do all of the accountability stuff. By the time I was heading up Arts SA in 2004, Flannery had managed to throw his weight around, his considerable influencing ability, sufficiently enough to extract concessions from both Di Laidlaw as Minister and then Mike Rann. In fact, Mike Rann's writing instructions to me at the beginning of 2004 were, quote, "Keep Tim Flannery happy, Greg." Over the years, the SA Museum leadership sometimes behaved abominably, and I can say this with a first-hand confidence, but I can also say it even though I'm publicly critiquing a collecting institution, because I've already said it in Hansard in the Statutory Authorities Review Committee testimony. In our desire to keep Tim happy, Arts SA provided the museum with $240,000 to establish a scientific press. The money was absorbed into the promised endeavour, and the promised Endeavour Press never materialised. After Tim's departure to greener pastures back in New South Wales, unbeknownst to Arts SA, his successor diverted $140,000 per year that had been specifically appropriated in a state budget process to support Ara Iricha, which is a world-leading South Australian AP Widelands Indigenous cultural knowledge database and repository. The then museum director diverted the funding to pay the museum's electricity bill, and it never again reached its intended beneficiaries. I only innocently discovered this last year, yet another sleight of hand and a tragically missed opportunity for Anangu. The fact that Ara Iricha has continued to flourish on project funding only is testimony to the commitment and passion of its advocates and protagonists, but also to the enduring cultural value that it is creating for Anangu. So how, you might well ask, do such things escape Arts SA's monitoring, the Auditor General's annual audit, and the ongoing board governance oversight role? Well, I can only conclude it's called clever accounting. It's the pea and thimble trick. Suffice to say, this is probably but the tip of the iceberg, and I'm not laying all blame at museum officers and museum managers. In recent years, the Auditor General has delivered adverse findings for our friends at the SA Museum. So now, mindful that all this bureau speak is variously either dry and boring or perhaps bordering on salaciousness, I do want to segue briefly to the fate of the History Trust. Fate and fortunes. How is it, I submit, that the History Trust has managed to traverse the many deprivations of life as an under-resourced statutory authority? Well, when I chose to apply for the role of CEO and walk away from my stint as interim director of what was a decade ago known as the Botanic Gardens and State Herbarium, it was in part because I like a challenge, maybe I'm a masochist, and in part because I deeply believed then, as I still do now, in the purpose and mission of the History Trust of South Australia. For years, as El Supremo at Arts SA and then beyond, up and down the slippery pole, I saw just how resourceful and impassioned was this small team with big purpose. And I was determined to turn the mouse that whinged into an entirely more effective beast, if not quite the Tassie devil that screeched or the dingo that howled. So I applied for a job that I knew would pay less than 2/3 of my previous income as a public sector executive, or even that which I was earning as a freelance consultant for my 3 years of garden leave. I was missing organisational leadership. So we fast forward 2 more years, and the prospect of a change of government honestly to 2018, the prospect of a change of government honestly scared the bejesus out of me. And then in mid-2018, so 3 months after the Marshall Liberals were elected, a mobile phone came to me one morning, one Monday morning, and it was the recently minted Minister for Education, John Gardner. He told me that he was in Cabinet and that the Premier had asked him to step out and give me a call. The idea floated was that the History Trust and Carclew and Windmill be mogged over to him as Minister for Education. To a part of me, that notion of breaking up the arts family was shocking, but in a nanosecond of pragmatism, it occurred to me that the Minister for Education's budget is the second largest bucket of money in the government. So, well, Minister, I opined, this is a novel idea, but I'm sure that with goodwill and good management, any machinery of government, thus MOG, changes can be made to work. The rest, as they say in the classics, is history. And with every privation that has befallen the arts sector, including our beloved collecting cousins along the North Terrace Cultural Precinct, the wisdom of that decision has been paused for gratitude and thanks, not only by me, by my senior colleagues, and by our board of trustees. So, to the future, what fates await our precious cultural institutions? I guess in a sense we'll have to wait and see. The long-promised cultural policy, which I have to say for the first 2 years of its development didn't utter once the words cultural heritage or collections or museums. While I may be exiting stage left in a few short months, I leave a history trust that is well governed, well managed and well led. My senior colleagues and their teams of energetic and passionate people will continue to make a difference. And as per the show bag copy of our most recent completed financial year will demonstrate, we are energetic, we are spreading what is at the end of the day about $6.5 million a year of taxpayer money. We're growing that with earned income and we're making a difference. There's so much more upon which I could riff, and so I extend a wee plug to my next public outing as part of South Australia's History Festival 2025, where the next instalment of the Thoughts of Gregushka awaits, in a central location that, when announced, will surprise many and delight most. Keep a watch out for the History Festival program later in March, and keep your May diaries clear of other distractions. Live long and prosper, and I'm really happy to take questions. Thank you. And have a drink.
Thank you, Greg, and I do want to encourage questions. I'm going to ask the first question, which is one of the prerogatives of being in this position, and that is that we've seen, wearing your history hat for the moment, apropos your last comment, we've seen the decimation, I think, in academia across universities of history departments.
Yep.
What are your reflections on that, given your passion for history festivals around the country?
Thanks, Rick. That is a perfect segue to another little favourite platform. History is a threatened species. History is in decline in the academies. history is in decline in terms of graduating teachers with some kind of basic grounding. Now, anybody can pick up the national curriculum and pick up resources that have been developed on the eastern seaboard that talk about all the things that we probably grew up learning about in South Australia, those of us who grew up in South Australia. We, at the History Trust, and this is one of the dividends of actually being attached to the Minister for Education, because he actually gives a shit. Education is important to the History Trust, and it's not just us, genuflecting to, the manner from which it comes. We were relieved, we were spared one of the most vicious cuts to the History Trust, that which was left by the Wetherill government, and it was about $500,000 a year. And when we moved to education, the then Minister, John Gardner, and look, whether you're a Labor person or a Liberal person, I don't care. You're either, there are good people and there are not so good people. John Gardner, superior human being, and I mean that in the best kind of way. John protected us by diverting some of his discretionary fund to offset. We still rendered unto Caesar the $500,000 a year that Caesar wanted, Rob Lucas, and we were able, in the deal that I struck was spare us that knife and we will internally reprioritise so that we can increase our impact in the education space. So we now, having previously focused for decades just on in-museum school group visits, we're developers of online resources that are national curriculum, Australian curriculum compliant, but that are a South Australian story centred, so that our kids, your grandchildren can grow up through the education system learning the kind of skills that the curriculum is designed to develop, but actually with South Australian history and South Australian stories at its heart.
Thank you, Greg. We've got a good period of time, 20 minutes or so there's plenty of time for questions. Who would like to be the first?
Don't be shy. I was going to line a few Dorothy Dixes up, but then I thought, nah.
I see a question here. Thank you.
Regan.
Nice loud voice. Regan.
Regan, yes. I was really interested to hear about the long history of the structural delays, which I was interested to learn that it's almost as old as me, possibly older. Is there something in particular about here that made it worse, or is this a sort of structural malaise that is experienced in collecting institutions across the country or indeed the world?
Thanks, Regan. Good question. I will think on my feet. The political cycles and the times in which political cycles occur confer and have conferred in the last 50 years, for example, points of emphasis and just distraction or detraction. I think at the moment, whoever governs, and this is not a partisan, in any way, partisan reflection, they're very politically far smarter and far more focused on how to win marginal seats and therefore achieve a parliamentary majority. I think there is a great hope, and this is not me, I'm trying not to make a political comment, but there is great hope in the expansion of the independent vote to diversify the points of advocacy and the points of agency and influence. Now, anybody who's known me for any amount of time will know that by and large, I'm a child of the Whitlam and Dunstan era, or an adult of the Whitlam and Dunstan era, and I consider myself to be a good social democrat, but I'm also a pragmatic business operator and also a deep cultural thinker. I think that in the case of collecting institutions around the country, most of them are in fact statutory entities, and that means that governments of the day politically appoint the boards. In different jurisdictions and at different times, the agencies of influence on those decisions have varied. So I can look back and, this will sound like me just, remembering the good old days, but I can remember Mike Rann and John Hill. We would always have as an item on our standing item on our agendas, board appointments, renewals, replacements, and that had been a pattern for decades. It had been quite bipartisan, where the minister of the day had confidence and respect for the head of his or her agency, and where a board was considered to be already governing well. And there's a few people here, Jad, I'm looking at you, a former board member, a trustee of the History Trust, and at times good decisions, good appointments are made, and at other times, like, where the hell did that come from? And you don't know what wheels within wheels are happening. I would still argue that because collecting institutions who hold gifts from citizens in trust for future generations, those boards should remain accountable and appointable by Executive Council, but not every cultural organisation necessarily needs to be following that model. In South Australia, I remember having lunch or drinks or something with Don Dunstan a gazillion years ago, and I said to him, "So Don, why is it that South Australia has the highest proportion of statutory cultural entities or institutions relative to any other state or territory jurisdiction?" And Don, and we were probably quite a good way into a couple of wet bottles of Wendouree, looked over his bifocals and said, I won't try and paraphrase, well, I will try badly to imitate him. "Well, my dear, it's very simple. The barbarians are always at the gate. And if you want something to endure, you legislate it into existence so that it's not just the whims and predilections of one government in one term that has to pass muster. Yes, you can starve, I'm now extemporising, but you can starve a statutory authority into submission by turning off the money tap. But the optics, the public attention, and the network of influence that attaches over centuries now for some of our cultural institutions is so deep and so profound, profoundly connected and influential that a government dare not tamper too much with something if it ain't broke. So I don't know if that's making sense, Regan.
I'll take a question up the back from Francis and down the front. There you go. Nice loud voice.
Frank, the Heritage Places Act is said to be under review.
Evan, can you speak up?
Yes, yeah, sure. The Heritage Places Act is said to be under review this year. Aside from all the considerations around structural buildings, the Act and interrelationship, what do you think needs to be there around the cultural protection concerning that?
Full disclosure here, this is Evan Moroney, one of the chief influencers around the whole Save the, thank you, the Cranker, Save the Cranker campaign. And, full credit to Evan, you and your colleagues, because what you did was manage to influence a Premier who's, in fairness, he's got many, many strengths, but actually really caring about heritage, maybe not so profiled in his priorities. He heard you and he acted. The place of, internationally, there is a a thing effectively about cultural heritage that is not just about the built heritage, architecture, design and character. It is about the purpose to which a place has evolved and been dedicated and cherished and loved. The Australian governments really need to be led by the Commonwealth, have not yet been signatories to the importance of this international convention. I would hope that if the Albanese government is re-elected, that they will turn their mind to it. There are things that you do and you can do in a second term that you can't do in a first term. In a first term, I remember so clearly, and I'm being a little bit discursive here, but Mike Rann and Kevin Foley had to return South Australia's AAA credit rating. It was absolutely important to our brand. It was important to the cost of borrowings, and at the end of the day, sovereign governments should borrow to build infrastructure, should borrow to create the commonwealth that will endure beyond one generation. While they were busy doing that, and they were a minority government, Rann and Foley really had no wriggle room. So, for example, when I went to Mike Rann about 3 weeks in to my time as executive director, and I said, Mike, Premier, the ring cycle, the 2004 Wagner ring cycle's budget has blown out by another 8 million. And that's a pretty hard thing to hear when the state had already put 8 million on the table for a cycle of opera, European, important canon to the European canon, opera, set of operas, and he was not a trasher, he was not a destroyer. He could have chosen to actually exploit the fact that that was a pet project of his predecessor, Di Laidlaw, and he chose not to. We went to Kevin Foley and we sat down and, Mike went to Kevin Foley, and then later at a drinks party, Foley, who, as we might all remember, loved a tipple, that I waddled up with his tinny in one of those little sleeves and said, hey Mackie, and this was Christmas 2003, he said, I understand you're not even in the job yet and you're into me for another 8 million. And I said, well, Treasurer, that is correct. And he said, but I also understand if I don't give it to you, we're going to sink the 8 million we've already put in. I said, yes, Kevin, buddy, that's right. And he said, well, I guess you don't give me any choice. Now, that was in the noughties, which once we achieved the AAA credit rating being returned, was the best of times. Revenues were growing at a steady pace every year. Of course, the cost of health was escalating beyond that, but fundamentally, the coffers were growing. We're not in that situation now. Sovereign governments around the world, and certainly in Australia, are grappling with debt that was incurred to get us through COVID, and are grappling with the inflation environment that has come from that. I know I'm kind of, I'm not trying to dance around it, but it's like these things are connected. The butterfly that beats its wings in the Amazon that causes the tidal wave in the Pacific. This kind of stuff actually in economics is real. And so we had to temper our enthusiasms and choose our timing. And putting, it cost $40 million to fix the insolvent organisations. And that's just to riff back to the thing I started, a comment I started about the fact that I didn't deliver an arts policy. I said to the Premier, I can deliver on what you've asked, but I have to counsel you that there are risks in so doing. Yes, the chorus for years, the Liberals didn't deliver an arts policy, and then, 6 months before the election that they lost, Arts Plus was delivered. I said, you will get a sugar hit for a nanosecond, but then I can guarantee you that every organisation and every individual practitioner who's not singled out for special treatment will then hate you forever. I said, so mate, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. What I will do for you is commit to making the arts more meaningful, more accessible to more people more of the time. And I think that's consistent with a Labor set of principles. And that's actually what we did. Sorry, I know I'm just turning back the hands of time now, but it's not well understood. It's not well understood, but it is what happened.
We'll take 2 more questions. Francis?
Francine.
There's a lot of talk about live golf and the $60 million or whatever budget they had to spend on the event each year. If you go out now, you've got $60 million to give away to the arts sector in this cultural precinct. Can you name something in each of those major, some of the mining arts institutions that you would gift? Something out of the pot of $60 million. What would it be? What would you...
That's a big curly question. So if I could play God for that's one more sleepless night, but a good sleepless night to have. I would say, in terms of the proximity round subject and focus being the collecting institutions, governments have never provided funding for collections development. The State Library, I was on the Libraries Board at the time, so 25 years ago, we had, I think, around 750,000 for collections. The cost simply now of maintaining digital journals would well and truly, I'm guessing, Megan, eat that up. But there has been no more money provided. The Art Gallery of South Australia relies on the kindness of benefactors. The History Trust, we have no real money for acquisition. We rely on the kindness and generosity of private and corporate philanthropy to grow the collection. So even though that would not necessarily fix underpinning problems, it would target the very purpose for which these institutions were established, to develop and hold, interpret and share those collections for the people of South Australia and our visitors. If I had time to think more about it, I might have come up with something sort of more, just something different, but there, thanks, thank you.
This is the last question of the night, please.
I was just listening to that.
Okay. I take a question, yes.
David.
This is more of a broad question, but I'm just thinking.
Nice and loud.
Going back to the time of Dunstan and leadership and change. And I'm thinking of it with the backdrop of the museum and what happened when somebody tried to change something and the reaction to it in South Australia. Have you got any comments about South Australia's willingness to bring about change and where leadership comes from?
Thank you, David. Now, we have history together. We both served contemporaneously, David in the political side with Mike Rann and other ministers, including Jane. Am I? Yeah. And me on the part of the public sector. Mike Rann was wont to say more than once, Greg, you've got to understand, everybody wants things to be better, but nobody wants things to change. It is a paradox. It is a deep paradox, to which the solution that Mike found during his years was you commit to pilots. So we're going to have a pilot about extending the tram. We're only going to go from Victoria Square to North Terrace. And the community gave him permission for that spend. And then the next spend was to take it to Hindmarsh. And had Mike remained in power, he would, I absolutely know this, he would have introduced a tram loop around the city, which back then, and you're going to roll your eyes and not in disbelief, we're talking, a goodly number of years ago now, was going to cost 65 million. And Pat Conlon, his Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, knocked it out. And the cost now of implementing that piece of public transport infrastructure, unreal. The other great, we all want to say one of the great things about Adelaide is the 1 degree of separation. If you need to speak to somebody, you can find a way to them. That is one of the best things about Adelaide, and it is also one of the worst things about Adelaide, because with that connectedness, that special connectedness and permeability, comes groupthink. And when groupthink takes over, forget about the truth, forget about the facts, it becomes a compelling, self-perpetuating narrative, and sometimes not so good decisions are taken for the best of intent, but not so. There ends the thoughts of Gregushka. And can I just give a special shout out? During the time of the Camelot era, when I was Deputy Chief in Premiers, and we had a whole lot of stuff going on, Adelaide Thinkers in Residence, Adelaide Festival of Ideas, the Capital City Committee Directorate, there was a swag of innovative things. Integrated Design Commission. One of the people who put the wind beneath my wings is here tonight, Shane Webster. Shane is now the Chief Executive of Jarwin Aboriginal Corporation and doing amazing things around the country. But Shane, you would have been, 22, something like that, when you came to me and batted your eyelids? No. And just kept coming back and saying, I want to work with you. And eventually, he came to work with me, and we did good things, didn't we, mate? Yeah. Anyway.
Do you want to say something about the publications now?
Oh, yeah. So, look, on your seats was the History Trust annual highlights 23-24. Normally that would have been out 4 months ago, but anyway, there are circumstances, cheers, that led to a hold-up. That's only just fresh off the press. You might have picked up some media over the last 8 months about our acquisition of the original Priscilla bus and our project to restore that bus and to build an incredible permanent exhibit for it at the National Motor Museum. We are completely committed to this. It's pop culture, and so some might look down their noses at it, but it was in its time, 31 years ago, transformational. And there were other pieces of Australian cinema that had a similar impact, but Priscilla, in terms of promoting tolerance, acceptance of diversity, was set an international benchmark. So we're committed to that. We're also committed, my parting pitch, the Migration Museum, which I mentioned in my talk, I had helped get, I think it was 890,000 or something like that, to improve the permanent exhibits in the museum. That is now 20 years ago. The Migration Museum's permanent exhibits are tired, last century. They're almost, analogue compared to the digital reality. We've done a massive community engagement amongst the cold communities, and we will be banging the doors of the Malinauskas government and the Commonwealth about the importance of investing in the renewal of the Migration Museum. There endeth the lesson.
Greg, this has been a lovely evening, and there's a term in law for those of you who are lawyers out there, that when you go to court, you have what's called sometimes a voir dire, which basically means a truth-telling. And I think tonight we've had a marvellous truth-telling of what it's been like in these last 30 or so years that Greg has been a supremo in a range of areas and close to government and trusted by everyone to make sure that our history, our arts sectors have been well served. As I said, he's a wonderful son, not only of Adelaide but of South Australia. He's got the History Festival coming up for all of May, so please keep an eye on that. At the middle of the year, he's taking leave of, not his senses, but leave of his work life. And we're waiting to see what the next avenue that he'll be pursuing. But I've been delighted to have him address us tonight. Would you thank him once again? From the Friends of the State Library. Let me just make a couple of announcements and some thanks tonight. Thanks very particularly to Patricia Michelle for Lovely Wines, for Angela Bannon and her team in putting together these lovely little victuals that we've had. I do want to acknowledge Megan Burgess, who is here tonight. I didn't see her coming in, but Greg has mentioned her. Megan is the new director of the State Library, and I'm delighted she's here tonight, and you'll be hearing from her a lot more in the future as her work unfolds. I do want to mention our next proximity round speaker is also here, Elaine Bedstead, who is here, who will be speaking in April. We don't have a speaker during March because of the festival, but on the third Tuesday of April, Elaine will be addressing us in this very venue as part of proximity round. Thank you once again for coming out tonight. Thank you once again, Greg, and we'll be leaving here in the next 15 minutes or so as our time elapses in this particular